Okay, so this is session 4 of our series on the Common Core Mathematics for grades 6 through 8. And I'll go ahead and share my slides so that we can kind of see what we're going to work through today. Okay, so this is our final session of the middle grade series. I just want to draw your attention, if you have any questions, to the email address at the bottom of the front of the first slide there. If you have any issues that come along, please feel free to send me a quick message. So we've spent time in this series talking about the number system, talking about geometry, talking about algebra, and so we're going to finish up today. Oops, sorry. We're going to finish up today by talking about probability and statistics. And for this grade band in particular, there are some real changes that are going to happen with this content. And some of the changes we won't realize for a few years, and I'll talk about why in a minute. And then we'll talk about kind of what it means to teach these standards in middle school and how to assess for student understanding. And just as we've done in the past, we're recording the session for folks who can't join us this afternoon. And I invite you, if you have questions or issues as we go through the session, to type them in the chat box, and they'll get to me and I'll try to address them. So let's go ahead and jump in. As we've done in the past, I want to just talk a little bit about this shift piece today in light of what we're going to talk about in the content. And this idea of focus really comes into play in probability and statistics, because with the Common Core, what is different is that children do not have any probability before 6th grade. Now, in this transition time with the Common Core, you'll have kids come to you who have done statistics, or probability rather, in the past. But you know, that will gradually wane off as kids come to you who have come through the curriculum for several years. And part of that was an effort, two reasons. First of all, probability is a very anti-intuitive area of mathematics. You know, if you look at the statistics on lottery ticket sales, you'll find that lottery ticket sales go up significantly when, you know, when the jackpot is big, and there's statistically no reason you would win more often that time than you would if the, you know, jackpot was small, but yet more people play because it's all about what the. So from a mathematical sense, the standard writers felt like it was a good opportunity to put this off until middle school because it does require some level of rational thought, although some would argue that middle schoolers are not capable of that either. But so that's a shift in focus, major shift in focus from what was being taught before. Another thing that is intended with the standard writers is that children will use many of the graphing techniques that they've been learning in K-5 as a way to summarize those probabilities, display those probabilities, summarize those probabilities, and then, of course, you know, do significant statistical analysis in the middle grade. So that's a big shift in focus. And as we go through the standards today, you're going to see some major pieces as far as coherence, both vertically and within the grade level. And another thing to note is that what the middle school teachers do with probability and statistics in general, or statistics in particular, is going to be extremely important for when those kids get to high school. because they'll be doing some very high-level modeling, and we'll need to use those statistical methods that they've used in middle school and even build on them even more. And I think that, at this, 2013, this is a good opportunity for us to kind of shift that burden of the modeling piece to the high school with technology and with what some of the decisions people are going to have to make. I think that statistics should be even more important for all people to learn. So, so the coherence piece is really critical. And then, of course, in those bottom three categories, which deal with that idea of rigorous mathematics, we need to be mindful of how we're connecting the statistical skills that they're learning to those applications, and then the conceptual understanding, especially with probability, that has to be laid as a foundation in terms of, possible events and favorable events. That takes a real conceptual understanding on the student's part to then reason through those situations. So these shifts become even more important, I think, for this grade band when we look at this domain. So let's look at some standards here. There we go. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to toggle back and forth today and look at the grade level standards and then some tasks that go with each grade level, rather than saving all the tasks at the end. So in 6th grade, we have this responsibility of introducing this idea of variability, where kids get to know what it means for something to have variability, what it means for something to have, likelihood, in terms of questions that can be answered and have more than one possibility. And this first standard is exactly that the children, we need to, in 6th grade, provide explicit instruction about what variability means, as well as what different questions look like in the idea of variability. And that's where I like the Common Core, because they do give a lot of examples in these standards. And for some of the standards, I've included the examples today. In a couple others, I've had to cut them out just for space issues. So be sure to go back to the standards document and look up some examples, or as we're going to in just a minute, you can look at the Illustrative Mathematics website. But this idea that some questions have a range of answers is an important concept for us to really deal with before we just jump in to start answering questions. The second standard there then deals with how we then can answer a variable question, a question that includes variability, rather. And the idea that we have ways to summarize that data and show how that data rolls out. And we'll talk about some specific methods for that here in just a moment. But the fact that, we can talk about where the data is centered, kind of like a balancing point for data, how far the data is spread out, and then kind of, if there's any kind of overall shapes of the data in terms of where people's responses might cluster. That is also, these first two standards are very conceptual in mind, in terms of you have to have kind of these two understandings before you can just slam in and start crunching through some of the statistical analyses. And I think sometimes we jump and start doing all the math without taking a deliberate pause and having the student consider how the data looks, and what it means to look a certain way. And then this third one then helps us. I'm not sure why my screen sharing is stopping. Here we go. having some technical issues with technology overall today. It's been one of those afternoons. And then this third standard then for 6th grade really deals with the difference between a measure of center and a measure of spread. So what's the difference then? So a measure of center tells you about the data with a single number. It just tells you about all of the values. So a mean tells you where all of the values hover, kind of balance. A mode tells you where many of the values fall at the same time, and whereas when we're talking about things being spread out, whether it's a range or whether it's some kind of deviation measure, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment, that tells us how the values vary, how they change. And so it's kind of like this measure of center is kind of how it's clustered or how it's balanced, and then the measure of variation tells you how far spread out it is. So it's really important in 6th grade that we build that foundation. So then, since we've built that foundation with those major concepts, and let me add, by the way, that those major concepts need to be revisited. We don't just, have a discussion one day with our students and say, okay, here's what statistics are, here's what it means to be variable, here's what, and we move on. That's something we cycle back to repeatedly to help kids always remember why we can do this and what these measures mean. So then the second standard for 6th grade really falls under the actual statistics. And so we're going to have number line plots, dot plots, histograms. So those are things that kids have seen before, and probably, in the short term, they've seen those before 6th grade. But where things start to get interesting is kind of how specific. Remember that first shift in focus? Not only have we shifted the responsibility for statistics and probability to starting in 6th grade, we're also going to be very specific about what the teachers are asked to do. So you see here with this standard number 5 is that we're going to do some very specific summaries. And now, remember those bottom 3 shifts about how do we do rigorous mathematics? We have to have an application. We have to have conceptual understanding, and we have to have procedural skill all married together. Because if you look at these standards, this 5A, we cannot do 5A unless we have some real-world data to deal with. What sense does it make to record the number of observations if nothing's being observed? And so that's important to keep in mind. So, we're going to summarize the data, and it's going to also help us understand the data in relation to the context. So the number of observations, how we measured, units of measure, and you see this is this horizontal coherence that we're definitely connecting, well, and vertical for that matter. We're connecting the statistical analyses to how we measure things. And then this third one is where people start getting sure why I'm having screen sharing issues. This third standard here, this 5C, is where we get very specific about which measures of center, median or mean, and variability. So we're looking at the interquartile range, and so if children, that then logically leads us to believe they have to understand what quartiles are. So we're not just talking about the range of the data, but the interquartile range. Where does the data vary within that middle 50% of values? And then mean absolute deviation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then any overall patterns or any outliers. Not outliers, there is a mathematical definition of outliers that in older grade students they will deal with. But in 6th grade, we can start that intuitive kind of understanding of outliers, that, wow, you may have some data that's really out of the ordinary. You know, if you're looking at weather data, you might be saying, oh, wow, here's a day that was super hot, you know, that's an outlier for the rest of the data in the winter for temperatures or those kind of things. So it's not that they have to statistically there's an outlier and there's a statistical test for doing that. But it's that in 6th grade, we want them to understand that you may have some data that's kind of wacky that may impact the rest of your data. And then the 4th one, which I think gets to that point of why are we doing this? You know, why do we use these measures of centers? Why is it that I want to talk about the median income rather than the mean income when I'm looking at a population of people? What does that tell me? What information can I get out of that? And that's where you tie all 3 of those bottom pieces together from that shift, those three shifts with rigor. So I have to have a conceptual understanding about what measures of center do. I have to know how to find the measure of center. That's the procedural part. But then I have to be able to apply it in my context. So in this context, in this experiment, let's say, you know, which measure of center is most appropriate and why did I choose that? So as you can see, there's some real high-level thinking that kids are going to be doing. And hand in glove with this content standard then are going to be those standards for mathematical practice, which we've talked about in the past, but we will touch on one more time today.